as a local reporter, you interview someone and they agreed to be interviewed for your story. And the general expectation, not that we ever talked this through, the expectation was you're going to show up on the local news in your town. That was it. You didn't have to say anything else. Now, when you talk to someone, if you want to make sure, especially if they're saying something that's quite incendiary, you might say, hey, by the way, this isn't only going to be on the local news tonight at this time, but it's also going to be on our website, and there may be something on social media. And also, we have a partnership with this other organization as part of these other organizations. And so it's going to go national. And then this national one that's going to pick it up, actually, they have this organization that ties in with international news. So it's going to be global. So this little thing that used to stay on Main Street all of a sudden is zipping around the world. And so, again, someone could say, well, yeah, I agreed to be on TV or say that, but I didn't know everybody around the world was going to find out about this. And so that has changed how we do our business. And I can only imagine that it makes the job of protecting that information much more difficult. And we're trying some
Good
other
afternoon.
things as well with
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. And please feel free throughout the program just to sneak into the other room and grab whatever else you need to eat while the program is going on, because, it'll be easier for everyone to pay attention if they feel like well satiated, right, with the food here today. So my name is Renée Landers, and I'm a professor of law and the faculty director for the Health and Biomedical Law concentration and the Master of Science in Law Life Sciences program here at Suffolk University Law School. And I'm really honored today to welcome you to the 11th program in the Masterman Speaker Series on the First Amendment and the Fourth Estate. As you know from the programs and the title, this series is made possible by a generous gift from Edward Masterman, JD 1950 and LLD 1990, from Suffolk Law School, and his wife, Sidel. As the information in your program notes, the purpose of the series is to provide a forum for vibrant discussion concerning freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and all the responsibilities that flow from exercising those freedoms. Especially at this juncture in the life of the Republic, Suffolk, through the Masterman gift, appreciates the opportunity to contribute to public understanding about all of these principles. Two colleagues preceded me in managing the speaker series. The inaugural leader was Emeritus Professor Karen Blum, who I think was planning to come today, so she might join us later, who jump-started a dynamic series. And my colleague, Professor John Infranca, succeeded Karen in directing the program. He is not able to be here because he is teaching his first-year property class during this time. But I'm really grateful for their example and feel fortunate that Dean Perlman, who's standing in the back of the room, asked me to follow in the path that they have paved. One other conspicuous absence today is the creator of the series, Edward Masterman. Ed sent me an email late last week to let me know where he wrote as follows: I wanted to be with you to express my gratitude to you and the speakers. Please let me know how it goes. Of course we will. I'm deeply grateful to you, and I look forward to a long relationship. Warm regards, Ed. And we also look forward very much to that long and continuing relationship. So now for today's event. We are grateful to have two distinguished speakers whose careers have involved deep engagement with the First Amendment and with journalism. Jonathan Albano is a partner with Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, LLP, and has for 4 decades been working representing news organizations, reporters, publishers, and authors, and litigating access to public information. Dan Lothian is editor-in-chief, GBH News in the World. He has been a correspondent for CNN covering the White House, presidential campaigns, and breaking news, including foreign assignments, the funeral of Rosa Parks, and other significant events. Our moderator today is my wonderful Suffolk colleague, Dr. Rachel V. Cobb, Associate Professor of Political Science and former department chair here at Suffolk. Her work is salient at this moment as we anticipate the November elections because her work focuses on voting rights and political participation and public engagement. Today's topic focuses on truth in the age of disinformation, misinformation, and AI. In 2019, I spoke at a conference hosted by Chicago-Kent Law School on information dissemination and control practices by presidential administrations. This was what was happening at the time. In 2018, dictionary.com had declared the term misinformation its word of the year. And misinformation, as the panel will discuss, is incorrect information regardless of whether there is an intent to mislead. Disinformation is deliberately misleading information. At the time, new terms had entered the public conscience, terms such as alternative facts. And, since that time and, continuing, we as a country seem to have an inability to agree on some set of shared facts, which is not to say we have to all agree on the implications of those facts. And that makes, having public debate and forming policy difficult. In 2024, AI was added to that landscape. And its capability of conjuring false images and creating material that is not true, accurate, make it hard for an ordinary person to determine whether the information and the images they are seeing are real or are false. Misinformation and disinformation and the creations of AI have the capacity to distort the public debate and undermine the integrity of public policymaking, which such erroneous or inaccurate information is used to justify policy or forms the basis for public opinion. Today's panelists will explore the role of the Fourth Estate in informing the public in this increasingly complicated landscape. I know we all look forward to what they have to say about balancing the competing values of that the First Amendment protects with an interest in accuracy and, freedom from misrepresentation. Achieving this balance, as Anthony Lewis wrote in Make No Law, his magisterial work on the Supreme Court's decision in New York Times v. Sullivan, the accommodation of conflicting interests is always complicated. It requires judges to draw nice lines. It requires lawyers to argue. It requires academics to reflect. I dare say we will be doing all of that this afternoon. So thanks very much to our speakers, and we should get the panel underway.
Well, welcome, everyone. I'd like to I'm going to turn it over to our panelists in just a moment. I'm going to read a brief quote from the New York Times from September of 2023. After President Biden won the election nearly 3 years ago, 3 of every 10 Americans believed the false narrative that his victory resulted from fraud, a poll found. In the years since, fact-checkers have debunked the claim in lengthy articles, corrections posted on viral content, videos, and chat rooms. This summer, they received a verdict on their efforts in an updated poll from Monmouth University. Very little has changed. 3 of every 10 Americans still believe the false narrative. Okay, so today we are here to discuss how the media, lawyers, journalism schools are dealing with truth and how to talk about it, misinformation, disinformation, and AI. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan first to tell us a little bit about yourself and why in your professional life, or how in your professional life, you have had to deal with these issues of truth, misinformation, disinformation, and AI.
Well, that's a lot, and I know we all have to speak and answer questions, so I'll be brief. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. I love to get out and attend different events, to be part of panels where we can chew over all of the challenges that we face in our industry. I will say this is something that I've been at since I was a teenager. My first radio gig was when I was 16 years old in the Tampa-St. Pete area. I fell in love with the notion of you find something interesting, you interview people, you stitch it all together, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people can hear that story. There's a lot of trust that comes in that process, right? When the listener hears the story, they are, at least the way it used to be, is that there was a certain level of respect and understanding that you spoke to all of the people who really understood the story itself, that you did some research, that you wrote your story, that someone looked over your story to make sure that all your facts were in line. There's this whole level of vetting that took place. And then based on that, whether they agreed with it or not, they trusted that process when that story ended up on the air. It was true when I was 16 years old and my first piece that ended up on national news. There's more to that story. But all along, as I went from radio ultimately to local television across the country, ultimately to NBC News, where I spent about 7 years, and then at CNN, where I covered a whole host of stories, as you heard, the last 5 years there covering the White House. The thing I think a lot about each day, even now, is it's really about two things. One is trust, right? How do we regain trust in the media, in journalism? And the other one is truth. They sound very much the same, but they're quite different. One is something that I think we can somewhat control, right? Regaining trust is something that we have to be doing in all of our work every day. So how do we provide more transparency into the process to help people understand what we do and how we do it? How often are we spending time in a community where we are not just there to gather a story that we went in with a notion of and then wanted to put on the air, instead of spending time just listening to people to find out what are the things that really challenge them, or what are some wonderful opportunities that they can share with us. Those are the kinds of things that I think can really build trust with an audience, with a community, with people. Truth, and where I think we are with truth now, which is truth is what you say it is. There used to be a certain set of facts that I think we all dealt with. If I said the sky was up, that was truth. I think everyone, if you took a poll, would say, yeah, you look up, that's the sky. If you said the ground was below you, people would agree that the ground is below you. Now it all depends, right? If a particular candidate you support says that the actually sky is below you and ground is up, people would believe that, right? Now, obviously, that's somewhat of a joke, but in some things, you find that kind of disconnect where someone's political leanings or just something that they believe so much in and think they know all the facts, they then determine what truth is. And it's really hard to break through, and I don't know what the answer. Obviously, it's a long-term issue that has to be addressed. And in both of these, I think neither one is as easy as flipping a switch, right? It's a lot of hard work that has to be done to build trust in a community and to help people or recenter people around truth, that there are certain facts that exist, and no matter where you are, on the right or the left, those facts are very real.
Thank you. All right, so John, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your work, especially in the media, and how that and how you have been thinking about misinformation and disinformation.
Sure, it's great to be here. Thank you. So I've practiced law in the media space. I do pre-publication review, which obviously focuses on, is the statement true, and if it cannot be proven true, what kind of defenses would we have if there was a libel or invasion of privacy claim even brought? Also do media defense work and some affirmative litigation, access to court records, access to court proceedings, Freedom of Information Act work, and fighting subpoenas of news people. We don't have a shield law in Massachusetts, so that can be a challenge. I think this is relevant, but indulge me anyway. I grew up in Pittsfield, Mass., and our local paper was the Berkshire Eagle, which was in the not too far past saved by new ownership. But I think of this about the effect of newspapers. When I was a kid, one of my sisters had permission to, we weren't far from Tanglewood, it's in Lenox, there used to be popular concerts there. And my sister had a pass to go see Earth, Wind, and Fire, which some of you may remember, at Tanglewood. The concert got canceled But she felt like, well, I have permission to go out, so she didn't mention that to my folks and just went out with her friends that night. And the afternoon, we got the paper in the afternoon. So she came back from school the next day, and my mother said, I didn't really get to talk to you last night. How was the concert? She said, oh, it was great, great concert. I said, really? Did they do an encore? And my sister, God bless her, said, yes, in fact, they did too. And then she reached out, oh, I'm sorry. She reached out and like a, prosecutor, threw the Berkshire Eagle down, said, that's not what the Berkshire Eagle says. That concert, we all paid for that for a while. I guess I'll say this. We're going to talk somewhat about what's very troubling these days, the amount of misinformation and disinformation that's around and how we might be able to help with that. But I do kind of wonder, whatever kind of tinkering we do, maybe the problem's us, right? Maybe it's something inside of us that is susceptible to these kinds of beliefs that I hope we can help. It would be very disappointing to think if we can't do things to improve the situation, but I do worry. It's in us.
I think so much of what we have, when these words have come into being, it's not as if misinformation did not exist before. But somehow social media, the transmission of information so quickly has become an accelerator of information and the ability to push out whatever by anyone has happened at this level that is impossible to wrap our arms around. So how has the rise of social media and all of that, has that shifted the ground beneath you and your jobs in what you've been able to, when you think about sort of as a journalist, being able to talk about truth, have you felt like, wow, I am against a new tide that is coming at me in this whole new way? What's shifted?
Wow. A couple of things. And I'll give you one example. There was when I first started working at the White House, there was a woman who I had done business with, and so she had I followed her on social media, and she clearly did not support President Obama, and so she felt that she could send me a lot of information about what he was up to, nefarious activities, all these kinds of weird, at the time sounded weird, it's much worse now. But I recall one day she sent me a photo of President Obama at what was a series of photos of President Obama out and about. And then she was saying how he never, unlike other presidents on the right in the past, that he never stood in front of an American flag when he was out at events. And this was something that she had gotten from her friends group on Facebook. And she shared this, so look at this. He is here without American flag. He's not a patriot. He's not patriotic. And so that's the first one, and I'll tell you what my response was to that. The second one was she sent me a photo of President Obama in the East Room at the White House with some new curtains behind him. And there was supposedly this thing about what was actually written in the design of the curtains. And so all pointing to his connections to terrorism. What's interesting is she believed all of this information that had been sent to her friends group on Facebook and was asking me to disprove it, right? Tell me that he is patriotic because he doesn't have a flag behind him in these photos, or tell me that what's being said in these curtains. And I said, this is the only time that I was going to respond. In the future, I told her, I'm not here to debunk every crazy thing you bring, to my attention. But I pointed out those curtains were, it's just a design. Like there's nothing hidden in the curtains. And I said, and he doesn't walk around all the time with an American flag behind him. I can find plenty of photos across the internet that will show President Obama at an event with a flag behind him. And so what I learned obviously is that, you know, within what you want to believe, you can find on the internet. Not only can you find it, you have this sense of, so I wasn't crazy. There are a lot of other people out there who do believe in this, right? So it's not just a matter of information can be passed around very quickly, which is correct, right? That has amplified any of these crazy notions that people have about a host of things, because it moves very quickly, and there's no one editing. You know, whatever you decide to come up with, you can share it, and it moves very quickly. But I think that the part that really worries me is that there were people who would think things and say, "Nah, that's kind of crazy. I'm not going to share that," because they didn't have a way to know that that same kind of thing was being thought of by hundreds of thousands, if not more, people out there. And now it's confirmation. And that's more dangerous, right? Because now it's confirmed. It's not just bouncing around in your head. Well, now I'm empowered to start really share this and to go out and push this because I've got other people backing me up. And that's the part I think that worries me more than just the speed at which a lot of this information can be spread.
Yeah, it certainly goes to the question that John posed about who is to blame ultimately. So we'll get to that. But for you, in your life as a lawyer, how has the ground shifted beneath you in the last 20 to 30 years?
Well, this is not directly responsive, but I think the biggest change was online newspapers and what that did to the profitability of news organizations, as I think we've seen everywhere. Walter Robinson is former Globe Spotlight editor. I've heard him speak a few times, and he says, it used to be that the Boston Globe had two printers, one to print the newspaper and the other that just printed money, and because it was so profitable at that time. And that changed, and that's undoubtedly hurt the process of news gathering. But more to the point, I think so I think of it this way. A newspaper is responsible for the article they put online, right? But they are not responsible for the comments people write. That is not because of the Communications Decency Act. They are not considered to be the publisher of those statements. And if you expand that universe to all of the social media platforms, that's why Twitter and Facebook don't have to worry about their own pocketbooks if misinformation or even defamatory, actionable statements are disseminated. And I know that the policy process behind that protection was, and still is, very well intended, right? It was, if we impose it, they should be like the phone company. The phone company can't be sued if I say something defamatory, and they just communicate it. And so the thought was, this will restrict communication if they are responsible for everything. But it has led, it seems to me, to and contributed to the situation we face today, where, accusations of people eating pets, right? You can find it somewhere and say, oh, I saw it here. And so it's a problem.
Please.
Just one other thing about the comment section, which is really important, is that, so you have the people who are just commenting on how they feel about something, or, really moving into the overall discussion of the issue. And then you have those who are looking to generate attention, right? And sometimes it's hard to tell, like, do they really believe this, what they just said, or are they just trying to get people to follow them and to have their moment in the spotlight? And I think that's always a challenge as well. Like, who's looking to grow their influence or audience, and who's actually there spouting things that they truly believe.
Yeah. I mean, it raises the question of whose rights are more important and the harm that is caused from these comments. I mean, taking the case of eating pets, this community has had to pour so much money and resources, and the harm done to the people there. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, because I did not prepare for this ahead of time, there is somebody suing somebody here. Maybe somebody knows this. Yes.
There's a patient advocacy organization that is suing the speakers, the vice presidential candidate and the presidential candidate who keep, restating this falsehood.
Yes. So when we think about the regulatory state and the ability of anybody to say anything, and yet it causes harm, or what are the levers that are possible for perhaps shifting things?
Well, I mean, I hate to say this, but I think that's a tough legal case. If someone shouted out those statements on the street and caused and had the effects that it has had, I don't think there's a defamation plaintiff, right? The group is too big for anyone to have standing to sue. Say you're talking about me, that's of and concerning me. I think that's a problem. And the First Amendment cases that we think of as important, that protecting speech as long as it doesn't lead to imminent incitement, that's a pretty tough standard too. Now maybe they'll meet that standard in this case, given what's happened, but that is not an easy road.
And and this doesn't go to your legal question, but one of the things that we have spent a lot of time, or certainly some time doing in our news meetings recently, is finding that balance between reporting on some of these falsehoods and amplifying them, right? So, do you need to mention all of the details of something to talk about the broader story about misinformation or disinformation, right? And so, this is not an exact science, but what we often will do is, certainly in the breaking news portion of that story, in the immediate aftermath, and maybe the day after that, you do want to provide some of the details of what was said. But over time, you don't want to always keep kind of going back to the well with the gory details of it and speak more broadly of it, right? Because we can, in trying to inform people, we can certainly inflame a situation. And again, it's not a universal thing that we can do, but I think the fact that we're having those conversations are important and something other newsrooms I know are doing and should be doing.
Right, so there's no guidebook quite yet.
There isn't, no. We're moving with the times here and
Right.
trying to figure out what's the best way to respond.
But we all wish there was, right? So another thought is just addressing this issue of false narratives and what people want to believe. One line of thinking says that individuals reject new information that might contradict their standing beliefs. They hear something and they're like, you know what, not true. Another is that actually citizens are trying very hard to form accurate beliefs, but they vary in what they consider to be credible sources. And so the issue is the credible source problem rather than their desire to believe false things. So what happens when people don't agree on what a credible source is?
That's a difficult question to answer because it's a moving target, right? There are people who might believe something is a credible source until it's not, because someone they trust says it isn't, so they move on to something else. The way that I think we deal, certainly from a transparency standpoint, and you'll notice this if you listen closely to news reports, in the past we used to say, we spoke to a source, or we spoke to a government official, or we went out and did this story and we spoke to people who XYZ, right? We try to give more details. We didn't just speak to one person or two people, but we spoke to 12 people And we reviewed 14 documents, and we also, left messages to whatever you, sort of the things that go into your reporting, which in the past you really didn't share because you didn't have this mountain that you had to overcome with all of your reporting. And so as any of the work that you put into the narrative of your, that story that you're distributing, if it's one of those, what you would put in this is going to be a controversial story, it's not clear cut, like here are the facts, there was an accident, then you provide more details. And again, that doesn't mean that you're going to convince everyone, but our job isn't necessarily we have to convince people, right? What we have to do is we have to try what we can to provide as much information so that when you went going back to us, the problem, it's internal. We provide the information, and maybe over time, people will change. Maybe they'll have different influences in their lives. Sometimes different things happen to them in life that will make them, if they're anti this or anti that, and then they need that thing, all of a sudden it's not so bad, right? And so life circumstances and different influences, along with us doing our job well, hopefully over time will make an impact.
Yeah.
So I am always on the defense side of claims against the media. So lately I've reflected on how some of those defenses might play out these days. So, for example, Massachusetts recognizes what's called a wire service privilege. And so if you republish something that the AP published, the legal theory is that the AP is a reliable, credible source, so you cannot be held to be negligent, which would be an element of a private figure claim, if you've relied on the AP. Now, what about other publications? That line hasn't been clearly established. We can certainly think of a lot of publications that would not be considered reliable, but who's going to make that call? A judge, I guess. Another defense that never really took off nationally was, but it makes sense in some ways until today arrived, neutral reportage. So some courts have said, if politician A says X and politician B says Y, if you just are reporting on what these important people said, you're not endorsing either side, you are protected for that. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
But that leads to, right, that's kind of the Fox defense in the election. We're just saying what the president said. That has to be okay, right? And I think it wasn't too long ago, I certainly would have instinctively said, yeah, that's got to be okay. The president said it. How can you not? How can you not report on what the president says? But today's events kind of push the line there.
I will not pursue this, but it also raises the issue of what's happening with academic fraud and peer-reviewed journals that until recently we thought were, pretty good. Turns out with AI and other issues, there are some real challenges there. And then also the whole issue of purchasing your ability to publish in that. But another story, but certainly related to just this tsunami of information flow and how do we wrap our minds around it. Okay, shifting a little bit now to artificial intelligence. Washington Post, January 2024, AI is destabilizing the concept of truth itself in the 2024 election. Quote, politicians around the globe have been swatting away potentially damning pieces of evidence, grainy video footage of hotel trees, voice recordings criticizing political opponents by dismissing them as AI-generated fakes. At the same time, AI deepfakes are being used to spread misinformation. It's created a liar's dividend, said Haney Faird, a professor at the University of California. When you actually do catch a police officer or politician saying something awful, they have plausible deniability in the age of AI. So what can and should news organizations do about this? And what can and should people wishing to save themselves do about this?
It is scary. I remember the first time there was a video that was passed around of Key and Peele, spoofing President Obama, and it was sort of early AI, I guess, interaction with video, and how real it was, right? All they had to do was get the voice down, you put it over real video, you kind of manipulate it. And it's obviously gotten much easier to do that through apps and other more sophisticated ways, or less sophisticated, actually. You can really throw people off. If you remember at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there was this video on social media, Zelensky essentially telling Ukrainian troops to surrender. If you weren't necessarily really paying attention and didn't know exactly, every detail of his movements and what he looked like, you could potentially be fooled by that. In addition to that, most of the time when people are consuming news, it's not on a large screen TV, it's not even on your laptop, it's on your mobile device. And so it's harder for you to see something that may be a little off. The screen just isn't that clear. You're probably outside where the sun is also bouncing off of your screen. And so, things that maybe if expanded on a wide screen and you're there in a pristine environment, you might be able to tell that it isn't real. It's very easy for you to be fooled. I think, it's unfortunate because there used to be a time that if you saw something, it was probably real, right? It was always like, well, show me the video, show me the picture. And now whenever I see something that's really sort of spectacular, the first thing I think is, I wonder if this is real. Like, that looks kind of weird in the background.
But you're a trained skeptic.
Right. So we are, and I think, for us, we have to work harder at when we are using user-generated content, that we really have to vet it, know where it's coming from before we say anything about it, before we put that audio on the air, before we use that video as on our website or on TV. The one thing that I will say for the general public, and this sounds like, basic things, but sometimes the way you fix things are pretty basic, right? And what I tell people is, if you see something that just doesn't feel right, don't take that one thing to the bank, right? If my son is very good at this, he'll say, I saw this video, I don't know, I started looking around and seeing where else does that video show up, right? Is it on a reputable news site, or does it show up on multiple sites? And so there is a little bit of, investigative journalism, or people in general have to act as independent investigators every time you see something that might be a little questionable. Now, the problem then comes in when it isn't that questionable. It's just a basic thing, and it looks very real, and there's no red flag that is raised. And so those, I think, are more problematic, right? When it's just a basic piece of information, it's people will spread it and share it, but that information is false. And I think that's a little harder to manage.
Yet it's legal.
Right. Well, that's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
It's the law isn't particularly helpful here, it seems to me. Many of the statements that that we're talking about probably are not actionable. It might not be considered a false assertion of a defamatory statement of fact, as opposed to opinion or hyperbole. And even if it is, you get into this standard of care, right? It's sort of a version of this wire service privilege. Is it negligent to rely on the most amazing technology mankind has ever come up with? Well, I think I'd say yes. But you can imagine that being argued in defense of republishing items that come from artificial intelligence. And maybe part of the answer there is that courts will adjust to the objective evidence that it is not reliable, right? AI is very helpful, but all our law firms using some of it, and the cautions are strong, right? If it says here's the state of the law and here's the cases, you better click on those cases and read them, make sure they are real, and make sure that that is actually what the cases hold. So to just repeat it without verification, maybe there is a good argument that that's negligent or worse.
So it may be that we actually need to train our students how to do essentially reverse bibliographies, that they take it and check rather than find.
Right.
So a different kind of way of approaching it. But I wonder, do you think that we really are entering into a place where, I know that the law is always a little slow to catch up with technology, but it seems like, wow, we're like in the dark ages compared to what has happened just in the last few years. So do you imagine a new frontier of law and legal thinking around managing AI?
What's worrisome to me about that is there is a price to that, right? Right, we can imagine it. So, wait a second, what about this speech, which actually we wouldn't want to be restricted? So I just find it very challenging. I'm more optimistic about kind of the educational process of demonstrating that these are not reliable sources unless you do further checking. That, I think, fits perfectly well within the existing rubric of the law, but expanding liability beyond where it exists today, that's going to affect us in other ways.
And yet, so many people are so turned off by being in the political world, by participating in civil dialogue, because of the potential for people to smear them and say terrible things about them and expose things about them that may or may not be true. That is having a negative effect overall. So if they don't have legal remedies, are there other kinds of things beyond just educating people on how this is done to try to make the world a better place?
I'm not sure that anyone would feel any better if they did have legal remedies for being involved in political life or whatever. I think in general people might not want to do it because it's just going to be a major headache, whether or not there are any protections. What I hope will happen is that the harder that it is for people to do something, then the better people you will get. And that's kind of the way I think of it. So in other words, there may be people who just kind of wanted to do it for attention, but realize it's risky because someone might take your image and distort it and your life is turned upside down. And so there's a certain level of commitment from people who truly believe in what the mission is, what they feel they can bring to a particular office. And so it's a risk worth taking for them, right? So yes, are there some good people who will not step up because they are afraid? Sure, you can certainly make that case. But I do think that, if I truly believe in something that is right, and I feel that I can play a role in correcting something, I'm not going to let the fear of legal action or distortion or disinformation campaign prevent me from doing that.
This makes me want to study how McCarthyism actually ended. You know, I know there was that dramatic moment, if you know sense of decency, but it just crossed my mind. I wonder how it ended, and if something similar can happen. Hope something similar can happen here.
I mean, I take your point that there are a lot of people who are willing to stand up to it and put their lives there. But there are some people who did not ask for it and did not want to be public. So I'm thinking specifically of, I mean, in my line of work, of poll workers. And notwithstanding the terrible smears against the women in Georgia. There are election officials in lots of states right now who are civil servants, not really public figures, trying to do good things, and horrible things are being said about them and their ability to do their jobs, and requiring now security and all kinds of things. So it's so yes, we're asking a lot of our citizens. To stand up for truth and justice.
We are, but these are unusual times, right? And so, if we go back to kind of how we started, how do we fix these things? It isn't easy, and sometimes it's painful, and we may have to ask a lot of people, and it isn't fair that if you are just living your life, working in a job that's away from the spotlight. You didn't sign up to be on the front page of a newspaper or to be the lead story on national news. You just wanted to do your public service, right? And so we are asking a lot of someone to be brave enough to step up and get security and go and do that job because it's the right thing for you to do. That is a lot. I still believe I'm a glass half full kind of person rather than half empty. And I still believe that while the numbers may be smaller, there are still people out there who will say, am I afraid to go to that job at a polling station? Yes, I am. Do I believe in something that is greater than my fear? Yes. And I'm going to go out the door and I'm going to carry my security with me and I'm going to go do my job. Because they realize, those who do show up, realize that there are fewer of them who are willing to take that risk. And so that even enhances the desire for them to do what is right, as difficult as that might be.
Okay, well, transitioning slightly to, although not really, defamation. According to some media scholars, there's a new interest to prosecute, enforce, or litigate claims against the press over its coverage. In what ways does litigation funding, as seen in cases like Peter Thiel's funding of Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against Gawker, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, just to remind everybody, influence the legal landscape for media organizations and their reporting practices?
Yeah, so, years ago, there was this doctrine, I can't remember which came first. Was it champerty and maintenance or maintenance and champerty? You couldn't. This litigation funding was not allowed. And over the last, I don't know, maybe it's been 20 years, the thinking has been, no, that should be allowed. You could be funding good public advocacy litigation. And of course, now it's turned into this. It's rampant, right? Forget about the important political cases. People are investing in commercial litigation. They're just putting money into it and assessing the case and saying, I think you'll get this much, so I'll give you this much. I get what comes off the top, and it's I'm not a fan, but it's the real world, and we have to deal with it. Now, the defamation cases that have been brought, again. I hate to be a one-trick pony, but I'm always on the defense side. So, right, I belong to a defense organization. If you took a plaintiff's case against the media, you're out. But over the last 5 years, members of the defense bar have been recruited by organizations like, it's either Project Democracy or Protect Democracy. I should know, I have a friend there. And they've represented poll workers, brought defamation claims. I don't know how much it helps, but they're winning, and we know from the high visibility cases that plaintiffs are winning those cases. I love the glass half full, and it's inspiring to think of people making the decision-making process that you described. But God, I don't know if some of those big verdicts really, will they slow people down? Will the fact that Rudy Giuliani might not be able to get into his Florida condo, will that really stop someone from doing it again this time? I hope so, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Look, and I think for journalism organizations, everything that we have done has always, especially investigative pieces or pieces that you know that there are going to be some questions around, there are always legal teams who will review everything, and that's one of the things that you do, which is look over a story. You will oftentimes add more to the language, and then we have this battle that goes back. Well, that's too many words. What if we take these words out? Well, no, that changes it. Now you have to do it. So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the wording is just right to protect us. Again, you can't. If somebody really wants to come after you, they'll come after you, even if they feel that there's not enough there. If they just want to create a problem and tie you up in court, all of that can happen. But we do spend a lot of time with lawyers on those stories that are either calling someone out, accusing someone of something as part of a deeper investigative piece. We worked on something on orphanages in children's homes on the African continent recently. And the process of legal vetting that went into that was immense. I mean, we spent weeks going over every line of every series, and we get a version back, and then I look at it along with the reporter, and it's like, okay, now this doesn't read right. It lost the spirit of what we were trying to say. It protects us legally, so now where can we find that balance where the language is right? And it actually makes sense when we read it as a story. And so it makes the job a lot more difficult for us. But it doesn't mean that we stay away from stories because of that threat. If a story needs to be told and all of the goods are there, we tell that story, realizing now that a bigger investment is needed in order to make sure that we're minimizing the risk.
Has the job of lawyers at media organizations changed? And are there more of them now?
I can't say if there are more of them. I haven't seen any surveying of that. I mean, I think certainly the job has changed. It used to be you worried about what was written in the newspaper, what was broadcast on radio, and what you saw on TV. They were like these three mediums. Now there's social media, and now there's, there's also podcasting, which is, a form of radio. It's audio on demand, but there's certain different rules around podcasting. So there are more, there are new platforms and new features within the existing systems that makes the job, I think, more complex. There's also something, one of the things, and this is not directly tied to this, but just to help you kind of see how things have changed over time. So there used to be something where, as a local reporter, you interview someone and they agreed to be interviewed for your story. And the general expectation, not that we ever talked this through, the expectation was you're going to show up on the local news in your town. That was it. You didn't have to say anything else. Now when you talk to someone, if you want to make sure, especially if they're saying something that's quite incendiary, you might say, hey, by the way, this isn't only going to be, on the local news tonight at this time, but it's also going to be on our website, and there may be something on social media. And also, we have a partnership with this other organization as part of these other organizations. And so it's going to go national. And then this national one that's going to pick it up, actually, they have this organization that ties in with international news. So it's going to be global. So this little thing that used to say on Main Street, all of a sudden is zipping around the world. And so, again, someone could say, well, yeah, I agreed to be on TV or say that, but I didn't know everybody around the world was going to find out about this. And so that has changed how we do our business. And I can only imagine that it makes the job of protecting that information much more difficult.
And just to close the loop on this, do you find that you are going to legal more often or in a different kind of way than you used to vet a story or to make sure that the wording is just right?
I don't know that we're going more often. Maybe we are. I mean, I don't know that I've kept track of it that way, but I do find that I'm going to legal for more things, different kinds of things than I used to. You used to be, oh, can we just write this thing? It's like, no, you got to change that. Now it's, can we release this video with this? Here's what we're going to put in this quote on social media as well. You can't do that because maybe you need another slide to follow it so that first slide is more, there's more context to it, right? Those kinds of things that maybe you didn't have to think about because there wasn't an Instagram feed with, different slides that you had to, you
And
put
all
out
this
there.
visual stuff.
And the visuals,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So, I think a little bit more complex. I don't know if we're going, and maybe we're going more often because we're delivering more content in
Right,
different ways.
Right. So this gets to the question of now we have to train all of these young people in how to be journalists, how to be lawyers, who need to figure out what slide is appropriate, et cetera. So what are you thinking about when you think about the kinds of things that our young people need to learn and the kinds of skills that they need to learn in this new world of complexity, more information? What do we need to do for our young people?
Well, first of all, to Dan's point, imagine how diplomatic you have to be if you're a lawyer trying to tell a professional writer to change something they've written. That is,
So diplomacy is one thing.
yeah.
Well, how would you consider this?
Right.
Could we?
Could you live with this? And it's true, there's no guarantees, right? I used to work for a guy who did a lot of bank litigation, and a banker said to him once, how can we eliminate the risk of litigation? And he said, well, the only way to really eliminate it, you could stop lending money. Then you won't get sued. And I think of that with the press, because you cannot eliminate it. You just have to stop printing. But that's a good question, how to train people. I mean, the whole process is, from my perspective, it's sort of, you have to be a little paranoid when you read the piece, right? And I also think of it as, where's Waldo? Like, is there a plaintiff in here this is really a story about Jim, but then Jim mentions that his neighbor hit him over the head with a bat once, and is the neighbor still alive? Is he? I always feel guilty about. Is that guy still alive? Oh, he's dead. All right, we don't have to worry about him then. But I just think that process is what it's about.
So paranoia.
Yes, a little bit of
That's how
healthy
to-
paranoia.
I want, just to your story there about the banker, I wonder if that's even safe to say you're not going to do loans because you'll be sued for not doing loans. Right? And same thing as journalists, like, well, here's what you didn't do as part of that story. Sometimes it's not necessarily what you put in, but what you left out. But back to your question, I think one of the challenges with young people coming into the industry is that before, in the past, back in the days when wheels were made out of stones and I was coming up through the business, you had a young journalist and they came in, went to college, and then they learned the craft, and it was all new and fresh, and you learned the rules, and there were, you either had the ethical support in college, which I think a lot of colleges were not doing journalism ethics, which happens now. And then you learned whatever the rules or regulations are of your particular news organization, and then you went off and started doing your job. What's different now is that everybody's interacting with social media and all these powerful tools from the time they're whatever age. And they share whatever, and they post whatever, they create their own content with very little thought for any kind of legal implication. So there's a pattern that develops from a very young age. And you grow up with it, and you're very comfortable with all of the bad habits of interacting with your phone and with social media. So now you jump to a real job, right, in a real news organization, and we're going to tell you all those things that you did before, you can't do that anymore. Here's how you have to approach what you post about your private life or how you react to something as a journalist or even as a journalist. You can't just, that natural instinct that you've had for growing up with this device where you hear something and all of a sudden, I can't believe you, and you fire off something. You can no longer do that because there are journalistic issues, and then there are also legal issues that come from it. And that's the challenge, I think, because you almost have to rewire your more younger employees to say some of the habits that you're used to, you now can't do in this role. Now, I don't want this just to be like a negative thing, because on the flip side of that is the fact that young people are so comfortable, a lot of the things that they do with social media and storytelling is very intuitive to them. And so something that I might sit there and go, well, how are we going to break down this story and do this and tell this? And all of a sudden, someone who's just used to this, grew up with it, it's intuitive. Why don't we do this and we do this and we do that? And boom, yeah, that's how you do it, right? So there is the positive to it, right? The fact of the matter is that there are some strengths and some certainly pluses that young people can bring into the workplace and really help us. I don't like we overuse this reimagine, but we can really reimagine how we do storytelling in a positive way. But it's still, there are those negative things that come with this technology that they're so very used to.
I think about the other thing is what they can report, who they can trust when we're thinking about facts and the spreading of misinformation and disinformation. That they need to be trained skeptics. Journalists have always done that. But there seems to me to be a new layer here. And as we think about especially the politicization at times of some agencies and the information that governmental agencies are putting forth, I mean, I think at one point it was pretty okay to say if the government is saying it, it is true. But that is not necessarily the case if scientists have a gag order on them about what they can and can't say about climate change. In fact, I recently was writing for a government report and was edited that I could not use the word something climate because it could be incendiary. So I wonder how you are thinking about that and the training. How do you instill skepticism? How do you help them to think about what facts are and that whether the information that they are receiving is actually true?
Well, I can tell you, in the classroom, and I have at different times throughout my career, I've spent time either doing as a guest lecturer or one-off courses, more, in the past 8 years, involvement with Northeastern, as was mentioned earlier. And one of the things that has been relatively new in terms of coursework around in journalism ethics classes is that sense of skepticism around, and this is just one example, law enforcement and press releases that are put out. So I'll take you back to one of my earlier jobs at WPTV in West Palm Beach, Florida. One of the things that I would do every morning is I would go down to the Boca Raton Police Department because I was in their South County Bureau, and you would go into, there was an area where they had these trays with the police reports from overnight, and you would look through it and try to find something that stood out, what was unusual, you'd get your leads, and then you'd talk to a police officer and you put your story together. I don't know. I know for a fact that I wasn't thinking the way I think now about the information that was in that police report, right? If it was there and they said this happens, you said police say X happened, and that was really kind of the heart of our story. That was a launching pad for us into the rest of the story and how we covered it. One of the things I do teach in the classroom now is that we have to treat information that comes in a press release or in a police report, I should say, the same way that we treat information that we get from any other source, right? We have to ask those tough questions, or we have to use careful language. You know, we don't just take it as this is what happened, but, you know, police are alleging, or, you know, all these words that, by the way, when people see that on social media, it's like, why do they use alleged? You know, it happened. I saw the video. It's like, well, there's this legal thing, right? So it's really about changing the language that we use when we're reporting on everyone, including law enforcement, and not just believing, because as we know, there are a lot of, and we're not here to talk about, you know, coverage of law enforcement, but we know that there are a lot of issues that come up in the field when something happens, and then what is reported in a police report. And so that sense of skepticism that we've been talking about has to really move across all aspects of our coverage, whether it's an official person, a spokesperson, whatever it is, you know, you still have to be very careful with that information, and again, treat it the same way you would with someone who is not in an official role.
Right, and what Dan's describing goes beyond what, in some circumstances, the type of liability that could be imposed. So, take a police report. If the police report ends up in an arrest, then you are safe reporting that, doing a news article on that police report. In Massachusetts, anyway, if there's no arrest that comes from it, it's not considered an official act, so you don't get that special protection. But this idea of moving beyond what is protected to actually try and get at what happened is significant. The theory is, the theory came from trials, right? You report on someone gets on the stand and says, Albano committed perjury. And they said it, and it's part of the court proceedings, so you're free to report it. But you should include, in order to get the protection, it's got to be a fair report, and if I denied it, you'd have to include the denial too. But it's that kind of thinking that expanded into these other government records and actions protections.
Let's go back to your initial point, Dan, of the difference between trust and truth. And so how, when we think about the future and how we consider where we find truth, what is it that we want to help our educational establishments essentially to work on to help develop some sort of, I don't think we're ever going to have consensus, which is good. We don't want consensus around truth, for sure. But we also do not want alternative facts that we are speaking past each other, that we can't somehow find common ground to understand that, forget like the sky and the ground, but a graph showing increases or decreases, and then what we can derive from that. What is the landscape to get at greater connecting,
Right.
I guess, about truth?
It's funny you mentioned graph, because there's a segment in a course that I've taught around data visualization, and the importance of how you display data and the data you choose to share. But the important thing is what's the context of that, you know, and what's the samples? There are a lot of different metrics that you use that will help you determine whether or not something that you place in front of someone as numbers and your conclusion that is in fact correct, right? Saying a certain percentage of accidents that happen at an intersection, so you look at two different places, one intersection where 100,000 people come through that intersection, and another one where 10,000 people come through that intersection, and then there's an equal number of accidents that happen. Is in fact the problem greater at this one versus this one, right? If it's the same percentage, at a place where only 10,000 cars go through the intersection, that's where the bigger problem is. So we do a story and we say that there's a problem that happens here also happens here, but it's not the same, right? And so I think it's really making sure that people understand, that this has always been, this is no secret. People in journalism aren't great at math. There's a reason why they went to journalism, because they weren't great at math. And so it's really helping people, if you're going to go there and start talking about things, if you're not good at math, then you need to talk to someone who is good at math in order to make sure that you aren't making those kinds of elementary mistakes. Therefore, that continues to erode the trust, and then ultimately what people believe as truth, right? Because they'll just point to, well, you said that was true, and those things are true, but the way you presented them, because you didn't really, crunch the numbers within the context of what these two areas are, it isn't truth, right? And so I think it's not just a matter, again, of, I gave that example of this guy in the ground, though there are always going to be those people who will just make things up, and that's what they're going to believe. But I think for the people in the middle that are willing to listen and are willing to change, then we have to be buttoned up in what we present to them, right? We have to make sure that we don't slide into some of these for the sake of the narrative, for the sake of the political leaning of the reporter or the news organization, that we take those numbers to represent something when in fact they're not. So it starts with that, right? Like, we have to make sure that what we are putting out there is true. And sometimes I think talk about disinformation. I mean, I think that there are news organizations that are part of the problem. And then there are others who will put things out just because of ignorance. They just don't realize the damage that they're doing by not doing their homework. So it requires us to make sure that we are completely buttoned up, that we do our homework. We're not going to be perfect. When we do make mistakes, we need to say that we made a mistake. We need to correct that mistake, and we need to respond to the public when they tell us we made a mistake. That's where it begins. How it all ends and how it turns around, I think I wish I could see around the corner.
Well, going to John's earlier point about us, and the challenge with humans is our brains that are very, they don't really like change, and there's a lot that makes it hard. I was reflecting on an article about doctors, sort of adhering to myth, essentially, about certain medical treatments, that are small, but like the thickness of a shake for the elderly, and it's going to be that they are prescribing it but don't really know the data behind it, and not necessarily looking at whether that has made an impact on their health going forward. And these you would expect with doctors who are data-driven, et cetera, but not shifting their minds. So I think the challenge is, how do we get human beings to be willing and open to shift their minds, which is the perennial challenge. Yes. So I wonder if we have some brains in this room who would like to ask some questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. That was really a very enlightening discussion. And now we have, I think, a lot of, experts, burgeoning experts in the journalism field, and maybe watching online, and also law students who might have some questions about the conversation we just had. But first, let's just give a round of applause here. Is there a brave person who wants to enter this debate, recognizing that it's being recorded? All right, here you go.
He was taking notes over there, so we have to.
Hello, my name is Gordon. I am a freshman here at Suffolk. I'm a political science major. My question is about when people go onto like big medias and they talk and whatever, how do you distinguish like as news or like opinions? Like you talked about like that the platform, the news that they're giving out should be truthful, but they have a person that just goes on the news and just yaps about stuff. Like how do you make sure that that person that's yapping is news, and if someone were to write about it, like how do you regulate or make sure that the things that are saying is actually truthful?
Right. Wow.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, I'll answer that in two ways. I think, so there's one big problem we have is that oftentimes, so take CNN, for example. I think people sometimes have a challenge between some of the talk shows that happen in prime time. So Don Lemon, who's no longer with CNN, but what was happening in his popular show during prime time, people have a hard time understanding the difference between that and between general news coverage, right? That there is the sort of the talking head, more, news and entertainment-ish part of your day part versus, hard news coverage from, whatever, breaking news or from a beat in Washington. I've said it over and over, there are two different things, right? But people will just look at, this was on CNN. CNN is a news organization. Therefore, if this person said that, then that's news to me in a different way, right? That is news. So that's a challenge. And I think,
true.
and it's true, right? And, I think that's a challenge people don't understand it, which, then it goes back to the question, should all those things live in one place? I mean, it is what it is. That's where there are big ratings for these kinds of shows. And so as earlier we were talking about, what is it? Boston Globe used to print money. News organizations don't print money anymore, or if they do, they print less than they used to. So that's a challenge when that is popular and it makes money for you. How do you get rid of something like that? But back to the question, the second part that I'll answer your question with, is that you don't just put people on the air. So when people show up in these various, the talking heads, if you will, there is a process that we go through to vet each and every one of them. So, there may be the occasional guest that pops up that you haven't done the kind of research that you should, but the regulars who show up on our shows on GBH, there's a vetting process. You look into what they have written. You listen to a lot of what they've said, either on radio or television, or what they've posted on social media. It doesn't mean that you catch everything, but the idea is that you are putting people on the air who may have really strong opinions about something, but they aren't just making things up. Right? It is a political, this is how they view the world through their political lens. It's an important conversation to have, whether you agree with it or not, and we put them on the air. Again, as I've said it a few times, we do make mistakes, and there are times where somebody's on the air and they were spouting something that is completely wrong, and you won't see them on the air again, right? So it is, we're policing it, I guess is the best way to say. We want people to have diverse opinions. We don't want to just have one voice. We want people to say things sometimes, if this is what they believe, that might be a little bit edgy and might be right up to that line, but hopefully not over it. But we also should not keep someone on the air spouting false information, because that goes back to what I said earlier. We have an ethical responsibility as journalists to not do harm. And if we are allowing people to do and say things that potentially could create harm for a group of people or a person or a situation, then that's a problem for us.
Before we go to the next question, I want to acknowledge that the first person who was organizing this speaker series, Professor Emeritus Karen Blum, is now arrived, and there she is in the back of the room. So I just want to give a shout out to her. I mentioned her earlier this afternoon. Can I ask a question about, your police blotter? Oh, yeah, Jebo, go ahead. No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Oh, wait, I'll bring it over.
So I hate to be the second lawyer question in the room, but I think you're both pointing to it a little bit in both your discussions, right? Which is, given that we can see the erosion of New York Times versus Sullivan coming up, right? The sort of case that presents news media organizations with some protection for their non-reckless media reporting. You know, and the most recent sort of loss by Fox in relation to some of the people they put on to say things. One, do you see and predict sort of that further erosion to the point where maybe it's no longer available? And then two, once it becomes unavailable, do you think you're going to see a major shift in the conduct by television and written newspapers about what they do put forward and how they do that?
So the way I've been thinking about this is that it seems a little ironic to me that the group on the Supreme Court that has voiced certainly an interest in reversing Sullivan may have the opportunity, and I'm just kind of, forgive me, a little gross generalization, but it's going to be their media organizations that are in the crossfire, and that will likely be the type of case in which Sullivan could be revisited. It's so hard, I think, because on the one hand, you think of Sullivan, and Renée quoted Tony Lewis in her opening remarks. You think of, okay, we protected a political ad, which seemed like a pretty good idea to do. But our whole discussion today of misinformation, disinformation, people free to say anything they want about a public figure. I wonder if you put that kind of mentality on, would one conclude maybe given the digital world, we'd be better off if people were more afraid of liability. That's not where I come out, but I sure think people are going to be giving it a lot of thought on both sides of the aisles. I don't know if I really answered your question, but it's a hard one.
Would it change your behavior, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're careful. We're always careful. What I can't speak to is what are other things that are going to occur in the future that will sort of tighten that circle for us to where now we really have to rethink, do we do this or don't we, right? But I think as I look out the windshield now, I think we keep doing what we've always been doing, continuing to be careful. The one point I will say is that having someone on the air to say something that may be misleading is one thing. I think where you get into trouble is when it becomes a campaign, if you will, right? So it's not just this guest. Let's bring on another guest, and let's make this segment from a 5-minute segment into a 15 minutes, and then let's do a special on this. And even as you're getting pushback and complaints about something, you keep doing it. Oftentimes, and I'm not a lawyer, but oftentimes you don't get in trouble for the thing you first did. You got in trouble because you didn't respond to the complaints and you ignored it. And so that's where, that's a clear, there are people who go down the road and they keep going down the road and they make it even bigger and they draw more attention and then they dig in. And that's why I'm not as concerned about sort of the one-offs that potentially could trip us up.
Like, that's a great answer, right? So we're talking about legal standards, and Dan's response is, well, no, we're trying to get it right. Your mind as a lawyer, my mind, sometimes gets twisted because I think, well, they'll never be able to prove actual malice if you got 3 people on the record talking about, and that's the response. No matter what the standard is, we try to get it right.
So I have 2 quick questions, maybe they're not so quick. One is your police blotter. example or your police report example, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has this case pending right now about access to the names of the clients of the big prostitution ring that the federal prosecutors just busted. And, the background law in Massachusetts is that because of the way the cases came about, that those names are not typically released until the court decides to go forward with the charges. But there's been a lot of notoriety to this case, and there are exceptions. Exceptions have been made. Any predictions from the two of you about how that will turn out?
Predicting how a legal case will turn out? Yeah.
Maybe easier in Massachusetts.
I did
than
that
in
with
the
OJ
Supreme.
and I was wrong. So, I tend, I don't know. I don't like to predict how things will turn out. What I do, the business we're in, is reporting what the end result is, or what the process before the end result, before that arrives. That's kind of the real estate that I occupy, rather than predicting how something will turn out.
I think for the clients who are truly private citizens, I think the sentiment, that there will be a sentiment that their privacy rights, because remember, what's going on here is they haven't yet been charged. So clerk magistrate has to decide, is there probable cause to believe that you did this? So they haven't, if there is, then their names are going to become public. And I think where the court has been is, if it's a high visibility case involving, for example, public officials, then, and the clerk is performing a judicial function by looking at whether to issue probable cause, the Fed's press release sounded like there were some high-ranking government officials involved. So I think those might come out.
Right, so splitting the hairs there, depending on who the people are. And then maybe this will be the last question, a good way to end, bringing us back to AI. And some of this issue about how some of these new and evolving media platforms are regulated. There's efforts in Congress. There have been efforts to tinker with Section 230 of the Communications, the Decency Act, to try to change the level of protection the social media platforms have, which goes back to your question about New York Times v. Sullivan. And then California, which seems to be taking the lead and regulating a lot of these new technologies for privacy purposes and other reasons. The legislature just passed this big AI regulatory statute that Governor Newsom just vetoed, I think yesterday or the day before. Do you have any comments about where that regulation might all be going? The way California goes, the rest of the nation, I don't know.
It's hard. I mean, I kind of put the question to you folks. Do you think we'd be a better world if Twitter was responsible for everyone's tweets, and if Facebook was responsible for everyone's posts? Because that's the protection they're getting. And it's back to the phone company. So are they like the phone company, or are they like a newspaper? The AI regulation, I don't know enough about it to opine on it, really.
Well, it's about regulating, verification of its accuracy of the algorithms and things like that. So
I do think that back to the issue of ethics, they've always been, or there should have been even more, but there've been conversations around, as these things are being created, what is the potential ethical implication of it, right? What is the possible, beyond where we are right now, what is the possible harm that could come from something? And I think, any kind of bills or laws aside, I do think that that's an important conversation around any new technology, to figure out what are the wider implications of the technology beyond anything that currently exists. Someone asked me a question similar to this, and I said, I remember I was doing a contract. I always would ask for different things in my contracts. And one of them was, I always wanted a parking. I wanted covered parking, so that if you're leaving late at night, if it's snowing, if it's raining, whatever. So I was at a particular station, and I had an agent at the time, and I said, I'd like to, have the parking put into my contract. He says, well, it's general parking for everyone, and so you don't have to worry about it. I said, no, but I do want parking in there. In case they build parking, then I will be guaranteed my parking spot, right? So we put it in there. They agreed to it because it was kind of senseless. They're like, well, we aren't going to build parking, so who cares? Let's give him this thing and don't give him something else. I give you that example just as a way of saying, we really have to think about what happens when something happens down the road that everyone now is saying will not happen. Will we be in a position to support that, to fight it, whatever it is? What are we doing now for the thing that potentially could happen that we don't expect to happen? And I think AI would be in that camp, right? We don't really know what we don't know about AI, and there are a lot of smarter people than me or I or anybody here who focus on this day in, day out, who are having a hard time really grasping the full power of something that it sometimes feels like it's a living, breathing thing. So what would it evolve into? And then, more importantly, what will the power of this technology allow us to do beyond anything we can ever imagine now, right? We talk a lot about what AI does now, but what will AI allow us to do in an even scarier, at a scarier level, right? A much scarier, where all of a sudden things are being created and there are new kinds of opportunities that we couldn't even imagine. So that's kind of where I think about that a lot. Let's think about all the implications. Let's put things in place now that potentially could address in some way something that we don't even see.
Did they build a garage?
They did not build it. Actually, many years later, they did build a garage, but I had long gone. So
Bummer.
I parked outside.
Anticipated.
Yeah, and believe it or not, what ended up happening, I shouldn't even tell this story, it's because it's so silly. But what happened was I was working the late shift, there was a snowstorm. I came out, I didn't realize that there was the base of a light post. That the post was gone, but the base was there. It was covered in snow because the plow had cut. So I put it in drive and went forward and then stopped and smashed my vehicle because I didn't know it was hidden under the snow. So it proves that I should have had a parking space, but I didn't have one.
You know why they didn't build it? They were waiting for you to leave.
That's right. That's right.
Jonathan, any last thoughts before we conclude?
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, no, it has been a pleasure for all of us to hear these great minds really think about how they approach their jobs, giving advice to journalism organizations, to reporters, and to hear how the reporters think about doing their jobs and navigating the legal landscape. So please join me very much enthusiastically in thanking our speakers. I want to thank all of you for being a really patient and engaged audience, and I hope you will look for future programs of the Masterman Speaker Series and join us again to hear from other great minds on this topic. I must say that this last set of conversations really reminds me of the importance of the rule of law in all of this and the role that lawyers might play with that same level of journalistic skepticism in thinking about how to plan for unknown and unforeseen eventualities, so that the law actually protects us but enables us to evolve as a society. So anyway, thanks very much, and thank you, Rachel, also for your great moderating of the panel. These events require a team. Jennifer Karnakis, who's the executive director of the IP Center and who had a distinguished career as an IP lawyer at major firms in Boston before joining us at Suffolk, is a real partner in producing all of these programs. I'm also discovering that she has missed a calling as a graphic designer. She is just a truly great colleague in thinking about these events. So Jen, you should just, wave your hand, please. Thank you. In addition, the capable Suffolk support staff, Babs Mello, Carrie Cullinane, and their fearless leader, Janine LaFauci, really helped with all the logistics and production of this event. And the event today is being recorded with the capable assistance of Jenna DeLisi, who's sitting in the back of the room, from the University Media Services Department, and her colleague at the video camera. And we also want to thank our colleagues at WGBH, who will be helping us disseminate the recording after today's program. And then finally, the Suffolk University Law School facilities and food service staff allow us to enjoy the space and some good food. So please join me in thanking all of them.